Welcome to the Depth Psychotherapy and Astrology podcast. My name is Shauna McGrath, and in this episode, we'll be talking about Saturn transits as cycles of psychological maturation and self development. So, in this episode, we'll talk about what the Saturn cycles actually are, what they look like, the timing and rhythm, as well as the symbolic experiences that we all have at different phases of life as they correlate to these Saturn cycles. So, of course, this will include several Saturn returns that we will all hopefully experience over the course of a long and satisfying lifetime. We'll also talk about the minor 7-year segments that make up each Saturn return cycle. So, all of this will be viewed through a depth psychological lens. And essentially, today's question that I'm holding, that I'm exploring with you, is how does Saturn correlate to our journey towards healing, towards maturation, and toward inner development? My name is Shauna McGrath. I'm a depth psychotherapist and astrologer in private practice. And the purpose of this podcast is to create a bridge between depth psychotherapy and astrology and to explore astrology as a therapeutic tool. So I'm excited for you to join me in this process and in this talk today. So let's talk about what Saturn actually is in astrology. I think that whether we're astrology newbies, beginners, or we're practicing professionally, Saturn can certainly invoke a lot of strong feelings and can bring up some fear sometimes. So let's talk about what Saturn actually is, all of the wide variety of experience. So when I'm holding this conversation today, I'm really feeling and thinking about Saturn as a symbol of maturation, of the maturation process in moments in time and then over the course of a lifetime. Saturn is also a symbol of finitude, of limitness, limiting things. It's a symbol of life and death, limitations, boundaries. And Saturn is also a symbol of the confidence that we develop through experience. So it's not the confidence that we may think of as egotistical or sort of like a false sense of inflated kind of confidence. Rather, Saturn is a symbol of the inner confidence, the inner strength that we develop when we have experiences that either challenge us or refine us or mature us, or we simply have a sense of mastery by doing things over and over and over again. I'm thinking of, what is it? There's this anecdote about doing something for 10,000 hours. And once you've done that, then you become a master of that. And Saturn really embodies this phenomenon, this experience of the more that we do something, typically, we start to have a sense of surety with it. And of course, the whole the preamble to that confidence is usually feeling not confident and sort of feeling young or new or fresh. And so I think that Saturn can show the areas where we do lack confidence. It can be a symbol of that journey toward confidence. And for some of us, certain scenarios are a lifetime journey of developing confidence through experience and figuring out how to do that in a way that is sustainable and meaningful. I think that finding meaning is also a core part of Saturn, a core helpful way of approaching Saturn, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll talk about that more in a moment. So Saturn is also the wisdom that we develop through experience. It's a symbol of wisdom that can't be transmitted. It is experiential wisdom. So I'm contrasting this to Jupiter, where Jupiter is a symbol of wisdom through study, through knowledge, through intellect, through learning from teachers, through reading or travel, that there's a sense of wisdom that's gained through learning and knowledge and wisdom in that kind of way. Whereas Saturn is a symbol of wisdom, and it's a symbol of wisdom that we cultivate through lived experience. And I think this is so important too, because Saturn is a symbol of these things that cannot be taken away from us. The confidence that we develop, the wisdom that we develop through our lived experience year by year over time, those things we hold inside. And so there is this sacredness of experience when we're talking about Saturn. Now, Saturn is also a symbol of sacrifice, of whether that be choosing sacrifice or feeling as though we need to make sacrifice. And we'll talk more about that, because I think that there's this distinction between choosing sacrifice and then feeling like we're being forced into something. There's a polarity here of sacrifice. Saturn is also a symbol of building over time, creating a foundation. It's a symbol of being goal-oriented, having a plan to move forward, and knowing that what we're doing now is preparing us for the future, or it's leading us towards the future. Along with this, it's a symbol of aligning with your true values. And I think that Saturn, like this with the sacrifice, there can be a construing or a challengingness of Saturn when we're sacrificing something that compromises what our inner values are, or where there's simply a confusion or a misalignment with our values and what they actually are because of the cultural conditioning that we have in some way. So Saturn is also a symbol of the crone or the elder. Again, this goes along with the wisdom, and it's literally, I mean, if you look at the ancient texts, it's also literally a symbol of elder age and being an old person, or a person who has been through some challenging stuff. So there's kind of this like this quality of Saturn that emphasizes having lived life, and that when we do that, we become confronted with our mortality, with our limitations, but also, hopefully, ideally, we become more acquainted with the inner resiliency, the inner brightness, and realize that that's where it's at, that there is this value in the inner world while we're living in the material world as well. Let's see. I think, Saturn's also a symbol of security in yourself in this way. The way that we see folks who are elders in our lives, that embody that energy regardless of their age, when they are, when they've moved through their Saturn experience in a way that maintains their love of life, we see a security in them, sort of this groundedness. Saturn is also a symbol of the fruits of our long-term laboring. When I was thinking about this, I had recently learned that there are some trees that only bear fruit after 3 years, that and even during those 3 years, they require the appropriate amount of watering and care, and I thought that was so interesting and very Saturnian uh, that some things cannot be rushed and that some things do take time and space and a certain process of care that cannot be rushed. So this is Saturn. This is things take time. Now, some of the more challenging psychological symbols of Saturn, and I think this happens more when we feel trapped by Saturn, or trapped by Saturnian types of experiences. Saturn can also be a symbol of depression, low mood, hopelessness, grief, loss, and feelings of longing. Now, these can be experiences where we see an external cause or an external situation in our life that it's like, oh, yes, X, Y, and Z happened. And so, of course, it makes sense that I'm feeling this way. And, sometimes these things happen and there's more of an existential tone to them where there's not something external that we can point to. And I think when this happens, when it's sort of this ambiguous feeling of depression or hopelessness or grief, I think that is when we can really do this deep work with Saturn and to look at our lives and um, how we got here and what's being asked of us now at this point in time. So I want to emphasize that all of these things, whether it is these challenging experiences of feeling hopeless or feeling grief or loss, or simply, I think Saturn can also be a sense of like heaviness in life or a sense of, something as simple as fatigue or just kind of like where it feels like it takes a little extra effort to get through something. This is very Saturnian. So all of this, even sacrifice, maturation, limitation, confidence, these are all life experiences in being a human. And so I want to emphasize that Saturn in astrology, Saturn transits, Saturn placed in your birth chart, Saturn is simply reflecting experiences that we have in life as humans. And these are not causal. Saturn does not cause something, but it's more of a correlation. Sort of the classic analogy is that a clock doesn't make us hungry when it's noon, but a clock shows us, it marks the time, and it marks that we may quite possibly be hungry at noon. That's not always going to happen, but it's a high likelihood. And by looking at the clock and looking at our lived experience and our actual life, we can figure out what is going on here. And when we're hungry, we can know that we're hungry and that we need food and nourishment, and kind of like what's going on here. So I think this is why it's so helpful to understand astrology, because it gives us an understanding of, it gives us a model to make sense of these life experiences in being a human. Okay, so I want to talk about what the Saturn return is, because this is something that has come more into mainstream. It's more popular. I think there's so much more to Saturn than just the Saturn return. But what even is the Saturn return? So when Saturn returns to the place in the zodiac where it was when you were born, this is called a Saturn return. So this happens about every 28, 29 years or so. So it's a very long-term transit. And we can think of this. So, like, forget that it's Saturn for a moment. We can think of this as like a new moon phenomenon. So when there's a new moon, it's because the moon has traveled through about a month or so, about 28-ish days. It's traveled to be at the same place in the zodiac where the sun is. And that creates a new moon. The sun and the moon are so close together that in the sky, we cannot see the moon because it's right next to the sun. So we only see the sun. And so the new moon is this, this merging of, in this case, the moon, the emotions, the feelings, the intuition, like that kind of like day-to-day rhythm of how we're feeling and experiencing life. And then the sun, which is awareness and consciousness. And so at a new moon, it inherently has this planting of seeds or this new beginning or something new being initiated. And so we can take that idea and we can apply it to the Saturn return, which in this case, instead of the sun and the moon coming together, it is Saturn coming together with Saturn. So your Saturn in your birth chart is, let's say it's at 15 degrees of Scorpio. And so you're born, Saturn is at that place. And then after you're born, over the course of many years, Saturn continues to move forward through the zodiac. It moves through the rest of Scorpio, then it moves into Sagittarius, and then it moves into Capricorn, and then Aquarius, and so on, blah, blah, blah. And then it finally, after about 28 years, it comes back to Scorpio. And so we call this the Saturn return because it is returning. So this is a Western astrology phenomenon. Side note, in Indian astrology, also called Jyotish, also called Vedic astrology, they actually don't look at the Saturn return. They look at something different that's called Sadhisati, where Saturn and the moon are conjuncting by sign. So I think that's interesting that, like, of course, two different systems, but that they both really emphasize the importance of a Saturn transit. Okay, so yes, this is Saturn. So we know what Saturn is about. We have kind of a thumbnail sketch of Saturn. So how do we look at Saturn through a depth psychological lens? What do I mean by depth psychological or depth psychology? So there's two essential core factors in looking at things from a depth psychological perspective. And these are, first, we have a symbolic perspective. We look at things symbolically. And then we also look at the shadow of something. And so what I mean by the shadow is we look at whatever might be rejected or unspoken or unsaid or something that we're sort of like pushing away, or that we're saying, I don't like that, that's bad. So the psychotherapist and Jungian analyst Sylvia Brinton Pereira, in her book Descent to the Goddess, A Way of Initiation, says that a symbol is the best possible expression for something essentially unknown. She says symbolic thinking is non-linear, right brain oriented. It is complementary to logical linear left brain thinking. And so symbolic thinking, a symbolic way of viewing things, is that everything is everything can be symbolic, that it's not just the literal thing that it is. So for example, let's say, let's say you have a certain physical symptom. Let's say you have, like, you sprained a muscle, or you have a sore throat or anything like that, we can look at like, okay, what is it that how does this symptom affecting you? The body part, like let's say it's the throat and you've had a sore throat. Um, what is it around your voice that's like agitated, or do you feel like you haven't been able to speak up, or do you feel like you've been exhausting your voice in some way? Is there something that you've wanted to say but you can't find the words? So we're kind of like, we're not like, oh, it's just, a sore throat or whatever. We're trying to derive a symbolic, a deeper meaning underneath the thing. So I want to do this with Saturn in a moment. And then the part around the shadow. So Sylvia Brinton Pereira, in the same book, she says a shadow, or the shadow, is an unconscious part of the personality characterized by traits and attitudes which the conscious ego tends to reject. And so the shadow is not bad. The shadow um, is sort of like this container for anything that we reject because we feel uncomfortable with it in some way. It is entirely unconscious, so it's not something that we do on purpose, and it's usually a protective measure. It's a way of protecting ourselves psychologically. So I think that, we can even like initially say Saturn. There's a strong rejection of Saturn in our culture when we think about Saturn as being aging, death, limitation, boundaries, things taking time. Like in our westernized culture, we tend to not like aging. Like we're conditioned to reject aging. We are conditioned to reject that something may take a long period of time. So I want to let's put a pin in that. So I think this is so important because I think that looking at things through this depth psychological lens, which is symbolic, and also looking at the shadow, we can do this with anything. We can do this with any planet or any experience. Okay, so let's talk about more about when a Saturn return actually happens. Okay. So Saturn returns happen about every 28 to 29 years. So, and it's a long-term process. So they happen with that frequency about every 28 to 29 years. And the actual period of a Saturn return lasts from about 2.5 to 3 years at a time. So this is because the Saturn return is during the entire time that Saturn is in the sign where your Saturn is in your birth chart. So going back to folks who have, let's say, for example, their Saturn in Scorpio. Let's say your Saturn is at that 15 degrees of Scorpio. When Saturn moves into 0 degrees of Scorpio, that begins the Saturn return. When Saturn moves to the next sign, to 0 degrees of Sagittarius, that ends that Saturn return for you. So that usually is about 2.5 to 3 years, depending on the retrograde process. And so I think that's important because it's not necessarily tied to the exact age. So depending, it's going to be, these are kind of the times of life to look for, but we're really looking at when Saturn is in the sign that it was for you. Now, when Saturn, in this example, for the person who has their Saturn in their birth chart at 15 degrees of Scorpio, of course, it's going to be more emphasized usually when Saturn gets within, I would say, like 3 degrees or so of that. Like when Saturn gets to like 12 degrees of Scorpio, that person is going to be feeling that Saturn energy, those themes, those life experiences more prominently. Now, of course, this is notwithstanding all of the other stuff in the chart, all of the other planets that Saturn might be aspecting, the house, the condition of Saturn, etc. We're just sort of looking at this one piece. But it is this whole time. And I think this is so important because there is this process, this 2.5 to 3 year process of maturation, of initiation that is happening. And so we may, depending on the length of life, we may have about 3 Saturn returns in our lifetime. First one happens at about 28.5 to 29 years or so. The second Saturn return happens when a person is around 56 or 57. The third one happens when a person is about 85, 85 and a half. And then for those of us that are living like really long lives, there will be another Saturn return at 114 years of age. So those are kind of, and we're going to talk about the 7-year cycles that, because that's also a big part of the Saturn experience. But I want you to have in mind that Saturn return is not just one event that we have to like get through and then it's like done. It's like, no, these are cycles of development that we go through. And wherever however our natal Saturn in our birth chart is configured. So what I mean by that is the house that Saturn is in, the aspects of other planets that Saturn is configured to. So for example, is Saturn in the 10th house of career? Is it in the 4th house of home? Is it in the 7th house of relationships? Is it in the 8th house of intense psychological experiences or debt and finances, things like this? And then also, is Venus in your birth chart? Is Venus making a square to Saturn? Is Mars making an opposition to your Saturn? Is the moon there configured to Saturn? So any planets, especially the personal planets, so the moon, the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, any of those planets that are natally configured in your birth chart to Saturn, those are going to be pulled in to this Saturn experience whenever there is either a Saturn return or any of these Saturn, these 7-year cycles that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And then, of course, the house. And so we can look at, these symbols that we talked about in the beginning with Saturn involving maturation and limitation and confidence through experience. We can start to say, okay, this is the potential. These are the themes in your birth chart. And then we can look at your actual lived experience of things and start to get a beat for what is going on and like really what life is asking of you and feel into that more. So what happens between the Saturn return? What's so cool about astrology is there's broader cycles and then there's minor cycles. There's like a subset of cycle within the cycle. So it's kind of like this Russian doll sort of situation. So we also really watch for these 7-year cycles of Saturn within the 28-ish year of the Saturn return. And this is because every 7 years, transiting Saturn makes what we call a hard aspect to your natal Saturn. So so you're born, Saturn is, let's continue with this example. Let's say at the 15 degrees of Scorpio. And then about 7 years later, Saturn is going to make a square to your natal Saturn. It's going to make the opening square. And so we know this because Saturn will, so this again, we're counting it via the sign versus the exact age. So if you're born with Saturn in Scorpio, about 7 years later, transiting Saturn will be in the sign of Aquarius. And so this is a square aspect. And then 7 years from then, Saturn will oppose itself. So Saturn will be in the sign of Taurus in this example. So we start with the square, which is a hard aspect. And when I say hard aspect, I should tell you what I mean by that. I consider the hard aspects a conjunction, a square, an opposition. And this is because those aspects typically spur us into action. And there's sometimes there's sort of like a confrontation of the psyche. There's sort of like something that we need to that we're like confronted with, whether that is externally or internally. And there is, with Saturn, there is this heightened initiation or maturation developmental kind of process. So Saturn, let's say we start with the Saturn, you're born Saturn in Scorpio. 7 years from then, about Saturn would move into Aquarius, creating a transiting Saturn square your natal Saturn. About 7 years from that, Saturn would be in Taurus, so it would oppose your natal Saturn. And then about 7 years after that, Saturn would move into the sign of Leo, which would make another square to your natal Saturn. And then 7 years after that, Saturn will move into the sign of Scorpio. So we have 4 7-year cycles, 7-year sort of like points that make up the 28-year broader cycle. So like 7 times 4 is 28, right? And so I want to read to you this is from Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And she talks in one of the sections about this story of initiation into the underground forest. And she talks about that there is this phenomenon of 7-year cycles, especially related to initiation through developmental psychology and folk tales and things like this. So when I read this book, also, I read it more as related to human experience versus women. You know, she talks about the psyche, the woman's psyche, but I think that so much of these ideas are really about human life, regardless of a person's gender. So take that with how it resonates. So, okay. She says, so she talks about how in this story, the initiation in the underground forest, a person goes into the underground forest for a period of 7 years. And this is the time of a season in a person's life. 7 is the number accorded to the moon's cycles, and it is the number of other terms of sacred time. A person's life is divided into phases of 7 years each. Every 7-year period stands for a certain set of experiences and learnings. These phases can be understood concretely as terms of adult development, but they may more so be understood as spiritual stages of development that do not necessarily correspond to a person's chronological age, although sometimes that is so. She says, as a person transits, she uses this word, transits through these cycles, their layers of defense, protection, density become more and more sheer until their very soul begins to shine through. We can sense and see the movement of the soul within the body psyche in an astounding way as we grow older and older. So, 7 is the number of initiation. In archetypal psychology, there are literally dozens of references to the symbol of 7. And so, so she gives these phases, these 7-year phases from 0 to about 105, which I'm going to read off to you because I think they're interesting. She lists them off sort of in chronological order, but indicates that these are not necessarily tied to age. She says the following metaphors are fragments, but given expansive enough metaphors, we can construct from what is known and from what we sense about the ancient knowing, new insights for ourselves that are both numinous and make sense right now and today. These metaphors are loosely based on empirical experience and observation, developmental psychology, and phenomena found in creation myths, all of which contain many old traces of human psychology. Okay, so I would like to read some of these to you, and I'm not going to assign the ages to them, but I just want you to feel that like these are 7-year periods that she's talking about. The age of the body and dreaming, socialization yet retaining imagination. The age of separating yet weaving together reason and the imaginal. The age of new body, unfurling yet protecting sensuality. The age of new world, new life, exploring the worlds. The age of parenting, learning to parent others and self. The age of the seeker, learning to parent self, seeking the self. The age of early crone, finding the far away, giving courage to others. The age of the underworld, learning the words and rites. The age of choosing one's world and work yet to be done. The age of becoming the watch person, recasting all that one has learned. The age of re-youthing and more crondom. The age of the mist beings, finding more big in the small. The age of weaving with the scarlet thread, understanding the weaving of life. The age of the ethereal, saying less, being more. The age of noumena, the breath. And finally, the age of timelessness. And so I wonder if any of these ages spoke to you in your experience at this point in time. Because no matter what your age, if you're living, if you're a human being, you are within one of these 7-year cycles of Saturn. And we do so well with Saturn when we can find a purpose and a meaning, especially find a purpose through a challenging experience. So how can we apply these themes therapeutically? And when I'm asking this, I'm thinking about for you, if you're listening, for your own process of self-development. This is something that you want to journal about. And I'm also wondering for those of us who are holding space for others. So, whether you're a counselor or a therapist or an astrological counselor or a caregiver, these are some reflections that I may have as we think about experiencing Saturn and Saturn transits, especially. So we're holding Saturn as this developmental marker in life and projects and relationships. So I would wonder where and how you are saying yes versus no to things, and how that connects with your saying yes and no to something else. When we say yes to one thing, that means because of the limitations of time and energy that we must say no to something else. I would wonder where or how you may be feeling trapped in an experience or a stuckness. I would wonder in this stuckness if there is grief here. I would wonder what sacrifices you're choosing to make, and is it worth it? How is it worth it? What makes it worth it? I would wonder what power or choice you have in a current challenging situation. And if it feels as though there is no choice, I would question that. Is that true? Is it true that you have absolutely no choice? I would wonder how you commit and how you express your commitment and your devotion. Saturn is so much about commitment and devotion. How can you, uh, how can your responsibilities become devotions? That may require some creativity. And then what feelings, thoughts, and memories do you notice as you reflect on these questions that I'm asking? So these are things that I wonder when I'm sitting with my psychotherapy clients who are experiencing a Saturn transit or a Saturn situation. I wonder about these things, and I wonder when I wonder this, it helps me to see more of what they're feeling and experiencing, and it helps me to hold sort of this Saturn spectrum. And so let's come back to our question that I posed in the beginning, which was, how does Saturn in astrology correlate to our journey toward healing, maturation, and inner development? And for me, it's very clear that Saturn is a symbol of our developmental process, of our maturation process, and that there can most certainly be healing in that. I think, of course, there can be pain in that, and I think there can be suffering in that, which, life, there is suffering in the human experience. And so, of course, Saturn reflects this. And I think Saturn correlates to these themes in a way in which it it helps us understand and validate a challenging experience, but also see it as a cyclical process. And what's really cool about Saturn and Saturn transits is that I think is such a complement to psychology, and especially when we're talking about understanding developmental psychology and in models of developmental psychology. We say, okay, a person goes through these stages of maturation and development in, these years, and there's many different psychological frames of looking at human development. And we see this with the Saturn cycles, right? The Saturn return and then the 7-year Saturn cycles. And what's really cool is that we're so unique, right? Like we're not going to fit neatly into a developmental model. Like that's sort of like a broad system where we can find ourselves and we can say, okay, I fit in here. And then our unique experience, we're going to be looking at the configuration of our own Saturn in our birth chart, or your client if you're working with clients. And so this helps to at a more personal level, paired with talking, figuring out what your lived experience is and how you feel about things now, and then looking at the birth chart and looking at the transits, we can figure out, okay, how is this maturation process happening right now in a descriptive way? What is actually happening, and where are things feeling like there's some stagnation? Where is it feeling um, like we need more choice, or like we need more commitment, or we need more devotion, or where are we feeling grief, and where do we need to simply be with feelings of grief? Where do we need some more support, and things like this? So um, I think that Saturn can be a correlation in helping us understand the nature of maturation, that it naturally involves boundaries and limitation and time, but it also gives us sort of a personal, a more personal, symbolic, descriptive timeline. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I would absolutely love it if you left a rating or a review to help other people discover this podcast. My name is Shauna McGrath. I'm a psychotherapist and astrologer. If you want to learn more about me and my work, you can find me at theastropsyche.com. I am sending you lots of love and wishing you a wonderful day. I will talk to you soon. Bye.